attorney, and what I do is persuasive writing, right? So I take facts that are true and I shape them in a way to win an argument, all right? And that's part of what's happening here in this book of Samuel. But I will tell you that one thing about it would have caused this passage to get kicked back if he had given it to a partner to review it, all right? And the problem is he starts off with bad facts and then he doesn't address them. The bad facts, which is uncomfortable facts for your point, is that Samuel's kids were screw-ups, right? So there's this problem. This passage opens up with this problem, and then what does Samuel say to do about it? Nothing. All Samuel says is you shouldn't have a king. He doesn't give, I guess, just let it go? That's a problem, Samuel. And by the way, he doesn't address the thing. But there really are an army of Philistines at bay, right? So another thing that comes from the scripture is that, by the way, the elders in this story, they had a point. Okay? They weren't entirely wrong. And Samuel doesn't really help them out. Okay? Something else, because we know, I'll get all Paul Harvey on you in a minute. We know the rest of the story, right? If you sort of pull back and look at the whole deal, we know that, okay, Saul, he kind of does, he's an okay military guy, but he's not really much of a king. But who's after Saul? King David, right? Greatest king for Israel, unifies the nation, does all this wonderful stuff. And then right after David, you have Solomon, and Solomon builds a temple. So, I don't know, did it work out so bad by having a king? Right? And if I go back to our example before, when we were wandering around in the gymnasiatoriums in the world, and we were taken down, remember, Jenny, the stanchions, we had to take them down. Jenny does these beautiful works to put up, and then we have to take them down and roll them up and shove them in a cabinet. Kelly, you remember the thing you had to lift up, the keyboard you had to lift up and kind of throw up to the top of the cabinet, and it was hard. You think people came into the gymnasium cafetorium, saw us meeting there, were like, and then left? Did that ever happen? Yes. Yes, it did.
They wanted stained glass and water.
Yes, it did. Well, they wanted walls. Right? So, there was a real problem, okay? And you know what? In this building right now, there are two congregations meeting, right? There's us and there's Alas de Salvacion. There's AA, has a very, very vibrant, very big meeting that meets here all the time. East Valley Youth uses the facility. We've had great things. So, I'm not so sure that previous decision was such a bad decision. And you know what else? From some of those examples of where I was talking about, so you make life decisions out of fear or out of fatigue or out of envy, right? Well, who knows how those life decisions turn out? Okay, look, when I graduated from law school, I went to a big law firm. You know why I went to a big law firm? Because I had good grades. That's what you're supposed to do. You have good grades, Jim. Go to a big law firm. Social justice, blah, blah. You have good grades. You need to go to a law firm, big law firm, right? Well, here's the thing. While I was at the big law firm, right, I did do some political stuff, which gave me a job at the state, which now is giving me the job where I'm really doing exactly what I want to do. So, who's to say, who knows, right? And I guess what I'm saying is, the other lesson that we can pull from sort of looking at the big picture of this is to recognize, my dad used to say, don't make the decision, but it's not going to be your last decision, right? I think about, you got to have courage, right? Have the courage to make the important decision, right? But the wisdom to recognize you have other decisions to make, okay? This is not the last decision you're going to make. So, there was something in that scripture about God not being with the Israelites if they cry out, but we know he didn't mean it, right? Because he was in the later things he was. So I think that's a second moral we can take, which is to have the courage, but the wisdom to know that there's going to be next decisions to make after that. So that's pretty good, right? But it's still kind of negative-ish, right? Because we've got, hey, don't do it out of fear or fatigue or envy, and then we've got, okay, well, do your best, but no, you're... I actually think if we look at this passage, there's something a little bit more positive to take from it, which is the last point I want to make. The elders and Samuel are kind of talking past each other, right? Who is the reasonable character in this story? Who's the one who's reasonable? Well, it's God, right? God is hurt by this decision, right? Although he does a little George Costanza with Samuel. It's not you, it's me, right? They're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. But still, God is hurt by it. God doesn't think it's the right necessarily move. But what does God say? I'm going to smote them. No. Let them have their king. We'll see what happens. Okay? So God is the one who is sort of almost the understanding character in this story. And if you in the gospel reading, which we didn't read, which is where Jesus is saying this bit about you are my mother and you are my brother and all that kind of stuff. Well, what he's saying is the people who invite God into the process are his family. And in fact, I don't know if you all remember, but Linda used to talk about how Mark writes in like sandwiches. He'll have like two passages that'll frame kind of the main story. So in this passage for this day, there was the family comes is like the one piece of bread, and then he tells them to go away is the other piece of bread. And in the middle is this passage about a house divided can't stand, right? And it's basically Jesus saying, what you need to do if you're going to stay together as an organization is invite God into the process, right? You have to have God there. Now, that is hopeful in a sense, right? Because it's hopeful to say, hey, maybe we can do a little better. Maybe we can invite God in and sort of be a part of our decision making. And maybe that's something that we have as a faithful people. Frankly, the other two pieces of advice are good for a secular humanist too, right? I mean, that's not bad advice, right? Either one. Don't act out of fear or fatigue and envy, and have some perspective. That's good for anybody, right? It's nice to know something a little positive here, right? I do think it can be a little anxiety causing because, okay, how do we have access to God's will, right? I mean, I think if you think about it, we all know people who think they have access to God's will that say very hurtful things, right? And because they feel like they have this special knowledge of God, right? And even maybe not quite that sort of out of proportion, perhaps you've been someplace where someone says, well, this is what God says we should do. Or this is the Christian thing to do. Well, that feels a little bit manipulative, right? I mean, if you're just talking about, right? So we as a bunch of rational people sitting here, right, we're not exactly sure on how we do this, how we access God's will. How do we do what Jesus was talking about, doing the will of God, right? Or how do we have the information that Samuel had about talking to God? So I don't have a key trick right now on how we do that, but I do think maybe the key is to first think about it and try to do it.